Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP World History presentation. Today's presentation is all about the Mongols in pre-modern world history as we continue through our study of period 1, the 1200 to 1450 period in pre-modern world history. Previously, we focused on the development, characteristics, and effects of the major networks of exchange to include the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Complex, and the Trans-Sahara trade. In those presentations, we learned how important of a role states and empires played in securing those networks of exchange and enabling great economic, technological, and cultural exchanges to occur. Most historians would argue that in the late post-classical period, no other empire secured Eurasian trade routes and enabled such high levels of economic prosperity and cultural diffusion as the Mongolian Empire was able to do. The Mongols have a unique historical narrative in their rise to power over most of the Eurasian landmass. Rather than developing from a long tradition of civility and agricultural settlement, the Mongols were born out of the harsh and unsettling lands of Central and East Asia. In spite of their seemingly difficult beginnings, they would amass the largest continuous land-based empire in world history and foster an era of economic and cultural exchange unprecedented in world history. By the end of this presentation, you will be expected to be able to demonstrate your understanding of these three learning objectives. 1. Explain the process of state building and decline in Eurasia over time. 2. Explain how the expansion of empires influenced trade and communication over time. And 3. Explain the significance of the Mongol Empire in larger patterns of continuity and change. For a lot of world history, especially in Afro-Eurasia, the accounts of great empires were preceded by great civilizations. In this term civilization, it is specifically meant that the peoples of a region were settled, agrarian, and urbanized. These civilizations achieved a cultural sophistication to include a writing system, a complex and bureaucratic government, religious foundations, hierarchies of class and gender, and impressive works of art, including architecture, literature, and other intellectual achievements. From the earliest river valley civilizations were born the earliest empires, such as Mesopotamia's Akkadian and Babylonian empires, Egypt's New Kingdom, and China's dynastic empires. In the classical period, civilizations in Afro-Eurasia gave rise to the Persian, Greek, Roman, Han Chinese, and the Mauryan Indian empires. It was seemingly a necessary precondition for the achievement of empire, a sophisticated and long-held tradition of civilization. But what about the places in between the great empires of pre-modern world history? For example, the lands between India and China, or between India and Persia. Or what about the lands between Greece and Persia, or between Rome and Persia? Were these merely inadequate lands that were incapable of supporting human civilization? Were these lands too resource poor to sustain urban populations and sophisticated cultures? Were the people who inhabited these so-called lesser lands also a lesser species? Were the inhabitants merely peripheral people who were undeserving of the benefits and graces of civilization? Most of the historical sources preserved in the most significant pre-modern civilizations would suggest so. Outcasts, barbarians, brutes, and savages made up the peripheral peoples who retained their uncivilized ways of life in the places in between the great civilizations. Though many were assimilated through successful imperial developments by those earliest civilizations, not all peoples on the outside of the most intense zones of civilization conformed to civilization's rule. In historical tradition, these barbarians were also the thorn in the paw of the earliest civilizations, as they were known for marauding and banditry, invasion and theft, raiding and pillaging. What few pre-modern records concede to the barbarians were their roles in the peddling of goods, technologies, and beliefs across the land masses, and instead those records relegated these peoples to nothing more than barbarians. In pre-modern times, there were some examples of non-civilized nomadic peoples, or pastoralists, who succeeded in building states within the lands that existed between the great civilized empires. One of the earliest pastoralist state builders were the Zhongyu, who lived on the periphery of Qin and Han, China's northern settlements. Concerned for Chinese imperial sprawl into their grazing and hunting lands, the Zhongyu tribes were brought under a single political leader named Modun in order to rival the encroaching Chinese. Considered barbarians to the Chinese, the Zhongyu retained their customs, beliefs, and identity in the face of an expansive Chinese empire. And although the Zhongyu Confederacy was eventually pacified by China's martial emperor Han Wudi, it was evident that the pastoralists were not just entitled to their own land and customs, but were capable of protecting their land and customs from civilized empire. Other pre-modern pastoralists who achieved large state-building success were the Arabs, Berbers, and the Turks. However, no pastoralist people achieved the size and significance of state building as the Mongols achieved. Today, Mongolia is an independent nation-state that resides between the nations of China and Russia in Central Asia's steppe lands. The steppe lands are characterized by an arid environment with so little rainfall that the region is not conducive to agricultural production. The steppe lands offered little natural vegetation and no major water source to its inhabitants, so civilization was difficult to achieve. Prior to 1200, these harsh geographic and environmental realities forced the Mongols to live the nomadic and pastoralist lifestyle in the steppe lands. Granted, the mobility of the Mongols could have prompted them to leave the steppe lands and seek greener pastures in the civilizations of China and India. But this was not the goal of the Mongols this early in pre-modern world history. The day-to-day agenda of the Mongolian peoples was merely survival in the harsh steppe lands of Central Asia. Their small populations were divided among tribes, as most pastoralists were divided. This division made it difficult for the Mongols to unify, as most of these tribes quarreled with each other over hunting and grazing lands. It was from this contentious socio-political landscape that Mongolian military traditions were established and perfected. Those advantages included their rapid mobility and maneuverability, with their cavalry and equestrian skills. Additionally, Mongolian precision archery from generations of hunting in the steppe lands made every Mongolian male a lethal marksman. One tribal leader named Temujin, who was born in the late 12th century, would take on the great task of unifying the Mongolian tribes. Through his understanding and application of steppe politics, Temujin was able to forge alliances with other tribal leaders and defeat those tribal leaders who refused to recognize his rule. Into the 13th century, Temujin would take his new title as Genghis Khan, the universal leader of the Mongolian tribes, and the unified Mongolian state would be formed. Genghis Khan also altered the agenda of the Mongolian peoples, as he heightened their goals to the conquest of the nearby civilizations of China and the Middle East. Equipped with great military traditions, Genghis Khan sought to exploit the decline periods of a divided Song dynasty in China and the weakened and aged Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. Though Genghis Khan's military paled in comparison to the sizes of the militaries he would engage in China and the Middle East, he would capitalize on Mongolian military traditions. The speed of the Mongolian cavalry enabled them to pursue retreating armies when Genghis Khan knew his military had the field advantage. To instill a psychological advantage, the Mongols would employ feigned attacks on the battlefields, when enemies were led into ambushes as if they were no different than prey trying to flee a Mongolian hunting circle. The Mongols were uncanny in their discipline, organization, and resilience that they put fear into their enemies, as their militaries had nothing of the sort. Enemies that were captured were tortured and mercilessly put to death, and in many cases, those deaths were public spectacle in order to increase the psychological advantage of the Mongols. Lastly, the vulnerable cities were sitting ducks to the Mongolian cavalry. The greatest advantage the Mongols had over the cities of the enemy civilizations that they conquered was their siege warfare. Their ability to starve out large cities and ultimately take them over was attributed to Mongolian resilience, as well as their mobile siege weaponry. Siege ladders to scale defensive walls, trebuchets and catapults to send explosives over the defensive walls, and battering rams to penetrate the defensive walls were the things that made up the nightmares of the pitiful inhabitants inside of those walls. The Mongols invaded numerous nearby regional civilizations, including China, Persia, Mesopotamia, Russia, and Eastern Europe throughout the 13th century. In many of these regional civilizations, old states were displaced, and in their wake, the Mongolian Empire replaced them. Granted, after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongolian Empire would fail to remain a united political entity. Rather, Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons claimed their respective regions of the empire, as it dissolved into 4 different Mongolian kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms were established through similar methods of Mongolian conquests, but the individual Khan presiding over the kingdom would determine the maintenance of those kingdoms. Typically, the presiding Khan would determine the methods of maintenance based on his attitudes toward and relationships with his subject peoples. China was a target of Mongolian imperial expansion in the early 13th century. However, the Song dynasty in China had a recent history of dealing with nomadic invasions. Even earlier, during the 12th century, the Jurchen people of northern Asia near Siberia conquered the Song dynasty's northern territories of China. In effect, the Song dynasty really only governed over the southern territories of China by the time of Genghis Khan's invasion of China. As Genghis Khan did battle with the Jurchen Jin dynasty in northern China, his grandson Kublai Khan would continue with the Mongolian invasion of southern China. Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan's conquests of China were brutal, and ultimately Kublai Khan displaced the southern Song dynasty in 1279. As many Mongols resettled into the conquered lands of China, Kublai Khan did retain some Chinese political traditions. For example, he retained the practice of a dynasty governing over China, except this time it would be a Mongolian dynasty. In fact, he named his dynasty the Yuan dynasty, and it would retain control over China until its overthrow in 1368. Additionally, Kublai Khan recognized his authoritative universality and claimed the mandate of heaven, as preceding Chinese emperors had claimed. Kublai Khan also retained a vast bureaucracy so as to carry out the functions of his Yuan dynasty. However, he limited the number of Chinese, and more specifically, Confucian scholar bureaucrats, and saved those positions for his Mongolian kin and high-ranking military officials. Thus, Confucianism as the political and social foundation of China would be interrupted by the Mongolian militant presence. Kublai Khan would also employ segregationist policies to keep Chinese and Mongolian societies separate. For example, he outlawed intermarriage between Chinese and Mongolian peoples. He limited the Chinese in participating in the Yuan government, and he outlawed the Chinese from learning the Mongolian language. Many of these segregationist policies were put into place so as to protect the Mongolian identity and to stop Mongolian culture from being completely Sinicized. Persia and the Middle East also became targets of Mongolian invasions. Led by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, Mongolian armies rushed the Arab and Persian populations. At that time, the Abbasid Caliphate, though still in power, was very weak. Like the Song dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate had also been picked apart by invading groups from an earlier time. For example, the Seljuk Turks had established their states in some of the western lands of the Abbasid Caliphate, which sort of softened up the Abbasids for the Mongolian invasions the following century. Another of his grandsons, Hulagu Khan, would follow up Genghis Khan's brutal conquests in the Middle East. In the 1250s, Hulagu displaced the Abbasid Caliphate with his successful siege of Baghdad and established the Ilkhanate of Persia. Like his cousin Kublai Khan had done in China, Hulagu adopted some Persian and Arab political attributes, such as a large bureaucracy and the recognition of the universality of the Khan as a political, military, and religious leader, similar to that of the Caliph in earlier times. Also, like in the case of China, a great number of Mongols were resettled into the former Abbasid Caliphate. However, unlike Kublai Khan's practices in China, Hulagu allowed Arabs and Persians to serve in positions within the Ilkhanate's military and political systems. Also, unlike Kublai Khan's segregationist policies in China, Hulagu adopted integrationist policies and was more inclusive of the different peoples within his Ilkhanate of Persia. Though personally a Buddhist, Hulagu did not discriminate against the pre-existing religion of the Abbasids, Islam. And by the end of the 13th century, the leadership of the Ilkhanate of Persia would adopt Islam as the kingdom's official religion. Many resettled Mongols personally adopted Islam and assimilated into Middle Eastern agrarian lifestyle. In between the Ilkhanate of Persia and the Yuan dynasty was the Khanate of Chagatai. Chagatai was one of Genghis Khan's sons, and he governed over the mostly Turkish and Persian groups in Central Asia. Much like Hulagu's Ilkhanate, the Khanate of Chagatai would also adopt Islam by the end of the 13th century. Russia and Eastern Europe were other locations that the Mongols invaded in the late post-classical period. Late in his life, Genghis Khan did lead initial Mongolian invasions into Russia. However, his grandson, Batu Khan, would succeed in making the full-scale invasion of Russia in the 1230s. Much like the Mongolian conquests in the Middle East and in China, the Mongolian conquests of Russia were brutal, and Batu Khan would establish the Golden Horde over the conquered Russian principalities. However, the methods employed by the Golden Horde over the next 2.5 centuries differed greatly from the methods of control employed by the ruling Mongols in the Middle East and China. For example, Mongolian migrations into Russia were much smaller than they were in the Middle East or China. For those Mongols that did resettle into southern Russia, many of them retained their Islamic identity, as many of them had converted to Islam late in the 13th century. Rather than resettling numerous Mongols into Russia, the Golden Horde merely extracted tribute from Russian princes, who were retained in their positions of authority over their respective Russian principalities. So long as the Russian princes paid their tribute to the Golden Horde, they were left alone to govern their principalities as they saw fit. In essence, rather than integration or forced segregation, as experienced in the Middle East and China respectively, the Russian and Mongolian populations were mutually segregationist. They each retained their religious identities throughout the time of the Golden Horde, with the Mongols retaining Islam and the Russians retaining their Orthodox Christianity. Once the Mongolian conquests stopped and Mongolian governance began, a great era of cultural diffusion and economic prosperity would be experienced by Eurasian societies in the late post-classical period. Granted, the transition from conquering to governing was not a quick and easy one for the leadership of the Mongolian kingdoms. The Mongols had built the largest land-based empire in world history, and after Genghis Khan's death, that empire would divide into 4 smaller kingdoms. Yet the divided kingdoms would manage to inaugurate a great era of peace and stability. This is not an unprecedented trend in world history, as this can be compared to the division of Alexander the Great's empire after his death in the 4th century BCE. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided into 3 Hellenistic kingdoms. Though each kingdom experienced varying degrees of political and economic struggle, the end of brutal conquest enabled a period of peace and prosperity, known as the Hellenistic era, across Afro-Eurasia. Likewise, after the Roman Empire ended its internal struggles for political power during the late 1st century BCE under Augustus Caesar, it too would inaugurate a period of political stability and economic prosperity. This would be known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. That term has been utilized throughout history to describe other great empires who achieved similar periods of stability and prosperity. In fact, the Pax Mongolica, or Mongolian peace, would characterize the end of the 13th century and the first half of the 14th century. The Pax Mongolica fostered a period of greater integration during the late post-classical period, especially in Islamic, Buddhist, and Christian missionary work and diplomacy. Due to Mongolian protection and organization of the Silk Road, the roads were safer to travel than ever before. The Mongolian Khans employed the YAM system, which was a courier network with checkpoints and military outposts, similar to what the Romans and the Persians had during the classical period. This YAM system secured the roads and allowed for locals and foreigners to enjoy a greater mobility. Foreign travelers such as missionaries, like the Sufi missionaries, traveled abroad and helped to spread Islam in a time when many of the Mongolian Khans were personally converting to Islam themselves. Legal scholar Ibn Battuta from Morocco traveled abroad and visited many parts of the Mongolian kingdoms, including the Ilkhanate of Persia and the southern portions of the Yuan dynasty in China. Battuta, as he did in Islamic lands outside of Mongolian control, helped to tighten up Sharia law in many of the Islamic communities within the Mongolian realm. The Mongols even dispatched their own diplomats in attempts to improve their territorial positioning in Southwest Asia by improving their relations with Christian states of Western Europe. Rabban Sama was a Nestorian Christian of Turkic ancestry, and he was deployed by the Ilkhanate of Persia to Europe to meet with political and religious leaders such as Pope Nicholas IV and French King Philip the Fair in the late 13th century. Though Sama's goal to forge an alliance between the Christian states of Western Europe and the Ilkhanate of Persia was ultimately not reached, his visitation did lead to even more travel across the Eurasian landmass. After Sama's diplomatic efforts, the Pope deployed John of Monteservino from Italy, a Roman Catholic missionary, out to the Mongolian kingdoms. John safely traveled the Silk Road and ultimately made it to Mongolian-held China. Though he only converted a few thousand Central Asian and Chinese peoples to Roman Catholicism, he did succeed in building several Catholic churches in the Far East in the early 14th century. Perhaps the greatest account of foreign travel throughout the Mongolian lands was the account of the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. Polo accompanied his father and uncle throughout the lands of Central Asia, peddling goods and acquiring the luxuries of the Far East. When they arrived in Khan Balik, the Polos would meet Kublai Khan. Kublai offered Marco to remain in his court and serve as a diplomat. For 20 years, Marco Polo lived in the court of the Great Khan. And when he returned to Venice, he wrote his accounts of the Great Khan and the Mongolian peoples that he encountered. Without Mongolian protection of the trade routes, which characterized the Pax Mongolica, the work of these missionaries and diplomats would have been an impossibility. The Pax Mongolica was also characterized by great economic and technological integration through the Silk Road. As much as the Khans protected the diplomats and missionaries, they also protected merchant caravans that traveled extensively throughout the Mongolian kingdoms. One of the most significant technological exchanges in world history was made possible by the Mongolian kingdoms and their fostering of economic and technological integration. Gunpowder, a Chinese invention from pre-Mongolian times, made its way to Europe by the middle of the 13th century. Granted, gunpowder would severely alter social, political, and military traditions in Europe at that time, but if not for the period of the Pax Mongolica, the timeliness of and rate by which Europe would make those transitions would not have happened as they did. The Pax Mongolica was not just characterized by positive points of economic, technological, and cultural integration. Rather, the Pax Mongolica ended with a great biological exchange of deadly pathogens that claimed the lives of more than a third of the Afro-Eurasian populations. That lethal biological exchange was known as the Black Death. Between 1348 and 1351, the Black Death, a term used to describe the bubonic plague, ravaged the East Asian, Central Asian, Southwest Asian, North African, and European towns and cities. Beginning in the east and heading west, the plague entered the urban populations of Afro-Eurasia. Those towns and cities were interconnected through the land routes that were predominantly protected by the Mongols. Equipped to manage the diffusion of goods and culture, the Mongols failed to manage the spread of the plague. In the unsanitary conditions of late post-classical cities and the flea-infested labor animals that accompanied merchants into rat-infested towns, the carriers of plague sped through Afro-Eurasia with the speed that was afforded by Mongolian protection. Quite possibly no other post-classical group of people demonstrated larger and more effective imperial control, nor forced the world out of the post-classical period more so than the Mongols.